Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Chain of Command, which are episodes 10 and 11 of Season 6 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as requested by my viewers. This episode was requested by Connor Graham. So, Chain of Command is a two-part episode where Picard, Dr. Crusher, and Worf are sent on a highly classified mission into Cardassian space to sabotage a Cardassian effort to make a devastating biogenic weapon of mass destruction. In their absence, command of the Enterprise is given to Captain Jellico, who is a more strict and by-the-book captain whose new command style is hard for the crew to get used to, and he constantly butts heads with Commander Riker. While Jellico attempts to negotiate a territorial dispute with the Cardassians, Picard and his team soon discovered that the whole thing was a trap and there were no weapons of mass destruction. While Dr. Crusher and Worf manage to get away, Picard is captured by the Cardassians, who send in a master torturer named Gul Madrid to interrogate Captain Picard to learn what the Federation's plans of defense are for the disputed territory. Picard insists he doesn't have this information but is tortured anyway, and we get a battle of wits between Madrid and Picard as he is tortured. A reoccurring theme is Gul Madrid shows Picard 4 lights and insists there are 5 and tortures Picard every time he answers that there are 4 lights, wanting him to say 5. Meanwhile, after negotiations deteriorate with the Cardassians, Jellico learns where the Cardassians are hiding and with Riker's help manages to set mines and ensnare the Cardassians, forcing them to capitulate, including returning Picard. But before Picard is released, Madrid lies and says that the Enterprise has been destroyed and Picard must choose between a life of leisure on Cardassia or a life of perpetual torture. All he has to do to get the life of comfort is to tell him there are 5 lights. But another Cardassian enters and reveals that Madrid was lying, so Picard screams that there are 4 lights and then is returned to the Enterprise, where he resumes command. But later he reveals to Troy that in that moment he could actually see 5 lights. So this episode came out a month before the Deep Space Nine premiere, and it was obvious this was meant to sort of preamble Deep Space Nine as getting the audience used to the Cardassians as an adversary, which is likely why they were chosen as the main villains of this series, rather than any more familiar aliens like Romulans, as at this stage the Cardassians had only appeared in 2 episodes prior, The Wounded and Ensign Ro. And ever since I saw The Wounded, the Cardassians instantly became one of my favorite aliens, despite at that stage only being a one-off alien, which Star Trek had had plenty of. So I was so happy when they returned in Ensign Ro, and simply ecstatic when I learned they would become the main adversaries of the new spin-off series Deep Space Nine. So I was also happy when I learned there would be a 2-part episode involving them. While part 1 was pretty much what I expected, a suspenseful adventure full of intrigue, the second part was completely unexpected, as it was mostly just about Picard being tortured. But I actually ultimately appreciated it much more because of that. Although the torture aspect of the episode was inspired by the episode Ensign Ro, where the title character recounted a story of her father being tortured to death by Cardassians, I believe it was this episode that established torture as a main characteristic of the Cardassians, who became the Star Trek alien race most associated with torture and known for it. The torture storyline was inspired by the movie Closet Land with the late great Alan Rickman, which was also about torture, and I was actually surprised at the graphic nature of this episode, as it was much darker than anything Star Trek had done at this stage. Indeed, when the episode aired, the show was bombarded by complaints, especially from those who looked upon this as a family show, and this episode was far too disturbing for small children. And producer Jerry Taylor was once quoted as saying that she didn't disagree with these complaints and felt that the episode should have been accompanied by a warning. However, apparently Patrick Stewart was very enthusiastic about this episode, having been a strong opponent to the use of torture and a supporter of Amnesty International's attempts to ban torture. It is said that he watched hours of torture footage from Amnesty International to prepare for this role, and apparently he was really concerned when he learned that the script was getting a rewrite, because he was worried that the script would be softened, as he felt it was very important that the horrors of torture be explored in a brutal and honest way. But apparently the rewrite kept the heart of this intact. Some involved with the show believe that this is Patrick Stewart's best performance ever on the show, and that is partly due to the fact that he felt so strongly about this topic that he really threw himself in this role, including while he was performing the scenes where Picard was being tortured naked. He actually insisted that he be naked for filming these scenes. And personally, I completely agree with such sentiments, as Patrick Stewart completely nailed this, and the way the script was written was good, but just a baseline, as in scenes such as these where it's mostly just two people in the room talking, is most dependent on the acting, and both actors involved, Patrick Stewart and David Warner, absolutely nailed it and had amazing chemistry. We get one of the best Picard quotes of the entire series, where he screams, "There are 4 lights!" which is a classic Picard moment, which I don't think is undercut at all when we later learned the only reason he said that is because he found out Gul Madrid was lying and would have likely went along with him had he not discovered this. It was still a badass Picard moment that was the best fuck you ever given on the entire series run. Patrick Stewart has since spoken very kindly of David Warner, saying that he was an amazing performer. David Warner apparently was a last-minute addition to the episode and was cast a mere 3 days before filming, and recounted that he actually had to read some of his lines from cue cards put on Patrick Stewart's shoulder. David Warner previously appeared in Star Trek V: The Final Frontier as a Federation ambassador, and Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country as Chancellor Gorkon. So he was already familiar with Star Trek, but stated it was a tad difficult for him to get into the role on such short notice because he knew nothing about Cardassians. But to be fair for him, the Cardassians had only appeared in 2 episodes previous to this one, so there wasn't that much to be familiar with. And as Gul Madrid, he actually helped define who the Cardassians were going forward. The torture scenes between the two of them were just amazing, as Madrid would purposely do things to mess with his head. In fact, when I was a teenager when I first saw this episode, and I used some of these tactics to annoy my friends, such as in this episode where Picard was left hanging naked all night with no food or water. Gul Madrid appears the next morning drinking some water and asks Picard if he's thirsty, and when Picard nods, he simply drinks his own water and says, "Oh, I imagine so I had a friend who would constantly ask everyone for 50 cents to get a soda from the machine at school, and when I just found this so annoying, as he never brought his own money. So finally I said to him while holding 50 cents, "Oh, do you want 50 cents for a Coke?" And when he said yes, I put it back in my pocket and said, "I would imagine so." So I was a bit of a little prick back then. We learn a lot about Cardassian culture in this episode, as Gul Madrid speaks a lot about Cardassian culture, art, and history, and archaeology. This is referenced later in Deep Space Nine by Garrick, who states that their art and literature was second to none. Madrid's story of his childhood as being a poor, homeless orphan living on the streets also establishes the Cardassians as an impoverished society that were taken over by a militaristic regime that relied on war and conquest to solve their poverty issues, which was a great point of debate between Picard and Madrid. And it also established the Cardassians as racist bigots, as we get a scene where Madrid's little daughter sees Picard as being tortured, and Madrid explains that humans are lesser beings that don't experience things the way that they do. So even now you can see a lot of similarities to Nazi Germany, which was an obvious inspiration for the Cardassians, which would be explored even more in Deep Space Nine, with the Bajoran occupation being a very obvious metaphor for the Holocaust. So, continuing off of the Nazi analogy, this episode established the Cardassians as a major superpower in the galaxy, which of course would become a major plot point for Deep Space Nine. However, this is inconsistent with how the Cardassians have been established previously on the Next Generation, as their weapons and technology were revealed to be far inferior to that of the Federation. And in the episode The Wounded, a Cardassian ship fired on the Enterprise when the Enterprise had its shields down and they barely caused any damage, whereas now they were portrayed as having equal firepower to the Federation to be able to offer a meaningful resistance. But I actually think that just made the Cardassians that much more interesting. In this episode, they were shown as really good manipulators, as well as they successfully laid a trap for Picard and created propaganda to make it appear like he was the terrorist, which they used as a very successful negotiation tactic, which successfully tied Jellico's hands. So now let me get into the other aspect of this two-parter, Captain Jellico's turn as Captain of the Enterprise. Captain Jellico was played wonderfully by Ronnie Cox, who is an amazing actor who's appeared in such films like Deliverance, and he played the main villain in both RoboCop and Total Recall, and would later go on to play the recurring character of Senator Kinsey on Stargate SG-1. Cox stated in an interview that he has several family members that consider these episodes, Chain of Command, the only thing of worth that he's done in his career, and considering his body of work, that's quite a statement. Cox himself has spoken out very kindly about these episodes, saying that he's very proud of his part in it and thought it was one of the best things he's ever done. He also stated that he personally identified with Captain Jellico as a person and was resistant of the thought of him being a villain, and thought that he made the right decisions. Captain Jellico was definitely a very noteworthy character who could be said to be an inspiration or perhaps a prototype of Commander Adama, the lead character of Battlestar Galactica, which was written by showrunner Ronald D. Moore, who had a part in creating Chain of Command as well. Captain Jellico would also become a recurring character in Star Trek New Frontier novels, where he had been promoted to Admiral in those novels and would continue to be a thorn in the main character's sides. However, those associated with the show would also insist that Jellico wasn't intended as a villain and was more of a different way of doing things, as he was more hard-nosed, militaristic, and by the books. I have a feeling Gene Roddenberry wouldn't approve of such a character, as it kind of goes against his vision of the perfect future and of what the Federation should be like. However, it does really work for this episode, and I can really see that Jellico wasn't necessarily in the wrong. At times, I think he was being a bit more hard-assed than necessary, but overall, he was a very excellent negotiator with the Cardassians, and was particularly satisfying to see him get the better of the Cardassians at the end when he forces them to return Captain Picard. And as for his feud with Commander Riker, it's only natural for the audience to identify more with Riker and be more on his side, as he's the one that we're more familiar with and used to. However, when you look at it objectively, you can really see things from Jellico's perspective, and neither one of them is really in the wrong. They just had a different way of handling things, as Riker was definitely letting his feelings for Picard and wanting to save him dictate his reaction, and Jellico was looking at it more objectively. So it made the scenes where Jellico relieved Riker of duty completely believable, and I thought it was very nicely played. And it also made the scene where Jellico and Riker were being honest with each other, having dropped ranks, so much more enjoyable to watch, as they simply just berated each other's style of command. But again, it's not about right or wrong, they were simply different. I liked how Jellico really liked Data. The two of them got along great, as Jellico appreciated an android who would simply follow his orders without emotion and would be able to be a really good workhorse. So it was great seeing Data in the red uniform sitting in the first officer's chair, as I'm sure Jellico was much happier having someone like Data by his side. So now, inevitably, I'll have to get to the nitpicking portion of this review, where the biggest one to point out is how similarly the Four Lights motif was to a storyline in the novel 1984 where a torturer insists he's holding 5 fingers when he's really holding up 4, and eventually the one being tortured convinces himself that there are indeed 5 fingers. In fact, some people call this a direct ripoff. While the similarities are far too stark to be written off as coincidence, overall I don't really mind, as I thought it worked well for this episode, and there was enough other unique content from the aspects of the torture scenes where I did feel that this episode was still original enough. But the thing that I always found improbable is that they would send Picard, Crusher, and Worf on a covert mission like this, which would be much better suited for like Space Marines or Navy SEALs or Special Forces or something like that. Not a starship captain, a medical doctor, and a starship tactical officer. Now I know they try to give reasons for this by saying Picard is the only one out of a few with extensive experience with this type of subspace transmissions that the Cardassians are experimenting with. Indeed, we later learned that the Cardassians specifically included this in their misinformation to specifically get Picard. But I still find it very unlikely that they would send the captain of a flagship of Starfleet on a special ops mission. And the excuse they gave with Crusher is that she's a doctor and it deals with biogenic weapons. But are you telling me that Starfleet doesn't have any experts in biological weapons that would have more field tactical training as opposed to Dr. Crusher, who has none? And Worf, well, he's a series regular, so that's why he was there. It'd still make a lot more sense to me to have a special ops team. Also seems pretty unlikely they gave Jellico the Enterprise, who is an expert at Cardassian negotiations, just for this one mission, as many people admitted that there was a strong possibility that Captain Picard may never return, and Jellico's assignment as captain of the Enterprise could become a permanent one. And the Enterprise is the flagship involved in many different aspects of the Federation, so it seems ridiculous to have someone be the captain of the flagship who's more specifically focused on the Cardassians. And it seems like it would have made a lot more sense for them to simply just send in Jellico on his current ship to do the negotiations with the Cardassians. Also, we get a scene where Picard, Crusher, and Worf have to get a Ferengi smuggler to smuggle them to the Cardassian planet, and this Ferengi is named Damon Solok. So I wonder if his first name is Han, or maybe Hank, the smuggler Hank Solok. Anyway, in this scene, in order to get him to cooperate, Dr. Crusher rubs his ears and says that she will be very, very grateful, which highly implies she's offering sex. So I wonder how Solok reacted when she didn't live up to this expectation, or are they suggesting that she did, which wouldn't speak too highly of Dr. Crusher's character. Plus, the fact that she rubbed his ears, which is an erogenous zone for the Ferengi, could be similar as to rubbing something else, which again really cheapens Dr. Crusher's character. I just really didn't like the scene, and I thought it was completely and totally unnecessary and totally out of place. Apparently, the scene was originally supposed to take place on Deep Space Nine and with Quark instead of Solok, but when the decision was made to air this episode before Deep Space Nine premiered, it was decided it wouldn't make much sense to show Deep Space Nine before audiences were familiar with it. But personally, I think the entire scene should have just been dropped once that decision was made, as it was no longer necessary. And the aspect of Riker being the best shuttle pilot there is a characteristic that was never mentioned before or after this episode. So it was very obviously just a plot point made so that they could have a reason for Jellico to beg Riker for his help. But again, these are just minor nitpicks. So my rating for Chain of Command out of 10 is a 10 the best. I love episodes that are just two great actors in a room performing off each other. For me, this is far more impressive than effects-driven action sequences or artsy cinematography. This is what I personally think is great when pulled off well, and it was pulled off so well here, where Patrick Stewart gives what is arguably one of his best performances of his entire career. And the other storyline with Captain Jellico, played by a great actor such as Ronnie Cox, was also a hallmark arc of the series, as it gave us another view of what the Enterprise might look like if in the hands of someone with a completely different command style. So to me, this is one of the great episodes of the Star Trek franchise. So that's it for my review of Chain of Command. If there's an episode from any of the 5 Star Trek series you'd like me to review, just leave a comment below with the episode you'd like me to review and I'll endeavor to do so. But please, only 1 episode request per person, and be advised, because I'm backed up at the moment, it will be several months before I can get to it. Also be sure to check out my channel for many more Star Trek videos, as well as other videos on shows like Game of Thrones and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot.